So folks, thank you for coming today for our presentation about sleep and autism with Dr. Terry Katz. My name's Kirsten Barnard. I work at the Autism Community Store, and I'd also like to thank Brian B., my colleague at the Autism Community Store, who helped set this up for us and make that connection. We will save questions to the end unless it's super relevant right that minute, and please feel free to use the chat. And we are recording, so it'll be posted on our YouTube page when in a few days after this. So with that, Dr. Katz, go right ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten and Brian. It's been great working with you guys to set this up. Just a little bit of background about me. I'm a psychologist. I work at Children's Hospital Colorado and University of Colorado School of Medicine. And I helped start the sleep behavior clinic at Children's Hospital. It's a clinic that is focused on helping people with any kind of neurodevelopmental difference sleep better. And we've had lots of good success in that program. I say we because I work with a medical provider as well. So we kind of cover both behavioral and medical aspects of sleep in our clinic. I've also written a book that is geared toward parents to help their children with autism sleep better. And I've done research in the area, written blogs and done videos and things like that. So I love this topic because just like the title says, we really can make sleep better. It's a common problem for many, many people on or off the spectrum. And there's lots of strategies that can help to improve someone's sleep. So we're going to talk about some of those today. Okay, so just a little bit of background, I think, about sleep will be helpful before we get into some of the specifics about what can help. So everyone and everything, basically every living organism sleeps. There's all kinds of fun, I think they're fun, interesting facts about animals and how they sleep. I'm not going to go into all the details today, but really very interesting. Sleep's very important. Some animals sleep a lot. We have that here. Some sleep a very short amount. Some work together to sleep. So ducks, for example, will sleep in a row, and the duck on one end will have its eye open, its other eye closed. And then at the very end of the group, you've got an eye open at the very end of that row of ducks, so that everybody's kind of kept safe while people are sleeping. So it can be kind of communal in that way, as well as many individual differences. A ton of research has been done on sleep and fruit flies. So we've learned a lot from animals and insects about sleep as well. So with all that, we don't really know why we sleep. We know it's terribly important. Everyone wouldn't do it if we didn't sleep, and we're very vulnerable when we sleep, right? We're much more vulnerable to predators and things happening in our environment, but it's very important. And we know that if we don't sleep, lots of things happen. So sleep helps promote alertness, attention, memory, our ability to kind of get work done, overall better health, tied to many aspects of physical health and our mood as well. I don't know if Kirsten, if you can admit people, I just admitted someone who came. So just so you guys know that. So we know it's important. We know it makes a huge difference in how we function, both physically and mentally throughout the day. So we know what happens when we don't sleep well, and we know how things are improved when we do sleep better. So just some specifics around that, and thinking about it, that we, when we have sleep, it helps us remember what we've learned, improves our executive functioning skills, our ability to organize, our reaction time, our ability to think abstractly, creatively, and to be accurate in our work as well. So when we think about individuals who, might need a little more support during the day, there's more challenges, especially in learning with young people and young autistic people. If we can promote better sleep, we might make days better and things may go better in general. So I want to go over a few ideas about sleep. These will be important as we start thinking about strategies, as I've mentioned. So one thing to remember is that when we sleep throughout the night, sleep isn't unidimensional. It's not just like we're up or we're asleep. While we sleep, we go through phases of sleep, and we start with a very light phase of sleep. We then go into slightly deeper sleep and then very deep sleep. So N1, N2, N3 represent those different phases from light to deep sleep. And then we also have a dream phase, or REM, rapid eye movement phase. And we cycle through these different phases of sleep about every 90 minutes. So this will be important as we start talking about some other difficulties that might happen during the night. But for everyone really, once you're past infancy, you are going to cycle through these phases about every 90 minutes. We spend more time and less time in these different cycles depending on where we are in the night. So when we first fall asleep, we have some light sleep, and we spend more time then after that in very deep sleep. So most of our deep sleep, which is thought of as the sleep that probably helps promote physical health in particular, happens in the first part of the night. And as the night goes on, we're spending less time in that deep sleep, more time in a lighter phase of sleep, and more time in dream sleep, where it's easier to be awakened. And that's always made a lot of sense to me in thinking about it in terms of evolutionary terms. If we were out in the wild and we were just finding a place to sleep, and we found one, we thought, okay, this is good, I'm safe, I could sleep here. If we need both deep sleep and dream sleep, we want to get that deep sleep done earlier. It's harder to wake up during that time. We're going to be groggy. We need that deep sleep for our physical health. Let's get that over with soon, because we know we've hopefully have found a safe place to sleep. And then as the night progresses, we can go to these lighter phases of sleep and phases where we're more easily awakened, because things could shift and change during the night. But whether that theory is actually why or not, it's important to remember that that deep sleep happens earlier, and we spend more time in REM sleep and lighter phases of sleep later in the night. But we cycle through all the phases throughout the night. It's just about percentage of time that we spend in each of those. Okay, another important thing to think about and understand when we're talking about sleep is something called circadian rhythms. And circadian rhythms are something we have that help regulate many parts of our physiological functioning, including sleep. And they occur about every 24 hours. And those are patterns that regulate when we're hungry and changes in our body temperature, when we're sleepy, when we're more alert. And they're about every 24 hours, or not exactly 24 hours. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But the circadian sleep patterns is an important one, again, as we're thinking through what's regulating our sleep. That is one of the pieces that does that. An important piece for sleep and circadian rhythms, it's true for other circadian rhythms as well, is that we don't just have one time when we're really awake and one time when we're really sleepy, but it's bimodal. So we have 2 times in a 24-hour period when we tend to be the sleepiest, and when we also have 2 times when we're most alert. And that will be important, especially when we think about when we're going to sleep and what might be happen as we sleep throughout the night. But this bimodal pattern is important. There's some other things about this is important as well, and we'll talk more about this later as well. But we have a time of maximum alertness close to the time when we're kind of ready to fall asleep, about an hour before. And again, that same little evolutionary model that you want to kind of be on your game. You want to be alert and ready to notice things, concentrate if you're looking for a safe place to sleep for the whole night. So you get this nice push up. You may experience this as having a second wind. It's kind of getting late in the afternoon, early evening, you're tired, and suddenly you've got all this energy. And that's that circadian bump that you're experiencing. So I mentioned before that our circadian rhythms are about 24 hours, but they're not exactly 24 hours. And yet we operate on a 24-hour cycle. We don't rotate through and keep going to bed a little bit later every night and waking up a little bit later every day. So there are constraints on this. There are factors that help keep our circadian rhythms in line. And the term for that is Zeitgebers, or timekeepers. And really what those do is help us stay on a 24-hour cycle. So some of the zeitgebers that are important to think about are social demands. Everybody else is kind of going to sleep. The night, we're all tucking in. That gives us clues that maybe we see other people doing this. We should do this too. Just time cues. It's, your body just kind of gets used to, it's a certain time, we're going into bed, so you do that. I've always think that that's particularly relevant when we think about circadian rhythms around hunger. For many people, when it's noon, it's just time to have lunch, whether you're kind of completely hungry or not, because it's a time cue around that. And another incredibly important zeitgeber, especially when we're thinking about sleep, is light. So light helps regulate our circadian rhythms. And we're going to talk a lot about that in terms of ways to maybe help with sleep. But that is another piece. All right. So the reason light is so important is because it helps regulate our own internal melatonin. So some of you may have yourself or thought about giving someone melatonin, over-the-counter melatonin. There's been a lot of nice work that's been done showing that it helps with sleep. And by the way, a lot of that came from parents of autistic children saying, I gave this to my child and it worked. And researchers kind of followed up on that and did a lot of studies. So, but we know that melatonin helps regulate sleep. Melatonin is produced in the pineal gland, which is just this very small number of cells right behind the eye. Light goes through your eye, stimulates the pineal gland, and we get changes in melatonin. Light suppresses melatonin. Darkness, when we're in darkness, we produce melatonin. So sometimes melatonin is called the hormone of darkness. But we want lots of melatonin at bedtime because that's going to help us fall asleep. And just remember, light will suppress that. So being outside, being alert and aware of light early in the day is important, and similarly low light later in the evening and at night is important to help regulate our melatonin. And we'll talk a lot more about that. This slide just sort of shows how a little bit about what melatonin levels are like throughout a 24-hour period. So you could see that melatonin starts ramping up, melatonin production starts ramping up in the early evening. It peaks in the middle of the night, and then it starts decreasing as the night goes on until we're at a very low level in daytime. And there's just been some amazing work done looking at very complicated mechanisms around how this works in our body, and Nobel Prize winning work on this, which is, I think, just incredibly fascinating. But just to give you this idea of how our internal melatonin, our endogenous melatonin productions work throughout 24-hour period. So we've been talking about the circadian rhythm, and you could see that here. But there's another sleep drive, which is called the homeostatic sleep drive. Another important piece that will be important as we're thinking about improving sleep. And that's more a drive that just keeps building throughout the day. So the longer you're up, the more your sleep drive increases, just because you've been up, and that drive to need to go to sleep keeps building throughout the day. The circadian rhythm interacts with that. So again, it's going to override that homeostatic piece later in the evening, which is part of why we don't fall asleep very early, generally. But it's also important that another way that you can kind of affect that drive is with naps in the afternoon, or anytime during the day. So we want to think about that as well as we're thinking through how to promote good sleep. Okay, so there's just some general information around some sleep basics that I think are important, that we often refer to and teach people when they come to our clinic, so we can think about ways to affect behavioral strategies or implement behavioral strategies that might help with sleep. In sleep clinic, besides talking about behavioral aspects of sleep, as I mentioned, I work with a medical provider, and we talk about medical conditions that can affect sleep. And there are many, and they always need to be considered. And I'm not going to go through a lot of those today, but I wanted to mention them because they really are important. GI is a huge issue that can affect sleep, seizures, any kind of sleep disordered breathing, snoring, allergies, any coughing, any pain or itching, difficulties with nutrition, especially related to iron intake, because that can relate to restless sleep. And there are medications that can affect sleep as well. So in our clinic, we're always looking at those. If I'm working with someone and I'm not with a medical provider. I'm going to at least ask about those things. I'm not going to treat them because I'm a psychologist, but I may refer a family back to think through, like, oh, there's constipation that could absolutely affect your sleep. Let's work on that. Oh, you were snoring. Let's make sure someone looks at that and figure that piece out as well. Okay, so I do want to mention sleep disordered breathing because I think it's a particularly important area that we're always asking about snoring, always thinking about whether sleep apnea or just sleep disordered breathing that might not be at the level of apnea, but is still maybe affecting sleep is there. So the American Academy of Pediatric guidelines say that if someone is snoring 3 or more times a week, this should be considered by a medical provider, and we should think through what that means. It doesn't necessarily mean someone has sleep apnea, but we want to think through whether there's something we can do about that snoring, because it can affect quality of sleep as well. So things we look at there are, do we have, if we're actually talking about sleep apnea or sleep disordered breathing, is there snoring every night? Is it loud? Is the person restless? Do they sweat? Are they in an unusual sleeping position? Do they breathe through their mouths? For someone who is toilet trained and has not wet the bed in a reasonable amount of time, and they started wetting the bed, that could be another sign that we would want to look at. And this slide just shows what obstructive sleep apnea is. So you could see with normal breathing, you've got this nice open airway, and with obstructive sleep apnea, it's blocked. And it can be blocked for a variety of reasons, but there are things that then could be tonsils, adenoids, it could be low muscle tone, it could be just the structure of your mouth. Being overweight puts you at risk for this as well. But we want to make sure we've addressed that as well as one example of the kind of medical issues that can come up. If someone is snoring a lot, if there's concern about obstructive sleep apnea, and maybe some other things have been tried first around allergies or, using nasal rinses or something like that, they might need a sleep study. So we do these at children's. They're done in the community too for adults as well. And this would help to then determine whether someone actually does have obstructive sleep apnea. So sleep study is for that. It's for another disorder called periodic limb movement disorder as well. But generally, we're going to recommend this if we're worried about obstructive sleep apnea. And this just shows kind of the steps involved with this. This is what someone looks like when they're all hooked up. So this can be very challenging for many people with or without autism to cooperate with this procedure. Children that do just a very lovely job of helping parents know what to expect, helping their children do this, working on desensitization. And our clinic will sometimes provide additional support because an autistic person might need extra help to tolerate all the sensations that are involved with the sleep study. And sometimes, we'll start with just someone just getting used to just having their head touched, let alone having all these leads put on them and doing all this. So it can be a slow process, but it's an important one for someone who might need the study. And what I always say is that even if it's going to take a long time, let's work on this and do this in a way that we can, so we can rule out something important, because obstructive sleep apnea can affect your physical health. It can also make a big difference in how you function during the day. There's a lot of nice research linking untreated obstructive sleep apnea to behaviors that look like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, for example. So it might take a while, but we'll do it. Never kind of want to have anyone say, we just can't ever do this, so we're not. It's just like, let's make this a goal and prioritize it however we need to. There's lots of things on the list for many people to have to do throughout the day, but let's start to work on this and not just say, no, we're not going to do it, but put it on its own track to start working on these skills. And a lot of times working on some of those sensory strategies are helpful for other reasons as well. And then if someone is determined to have obstructive sleep apnea, then they may need a CPAP machine, which is, this is an example of this. So what this does is open up that airway through air pressure. This can also be challenging for individuals to tolerate. But again, with desensitization and practice, we have helped many children learn to use this. So again, sometimes people will say like, well, I don't think we can get through the sleep study. And even if we get through the sleep study, we're not going to be able to do this CPAP thing. And the answer is no, we can. We just have to give it the time that's needed to help someone learn to do that. Okay, and there's other medical issues. Restless sleep is an important consideration that we'll often think about, especially for individuals who aren't maybe eating enough meat. They might have low iron stores that can relate to restless sleep. So there's other things we look at as well. When we're thinking about sleep difficulties, though, and for people with ASD, it's not that different than sleep difficulties for other people, which is irregular sleep-wake cycles, difficulty settling, taking a long time before you actually fall asleep, waking during the night. All that kind of combines into maybe not sleeping for as long as other people, and maybe waking up very early in the morning. But these difficulties are often much more difficult for an autistic person than someone who has some sleep difficulties but doesn't have autism. So the intensity of these difficulties may be much more difficult. So for night waking, for example, some might hear about a child who wakes up during the night. They might be up for, once a night for maybe 5 minutes. Often autistic people, we are hearing about them being up several times a night and for hours at a time, for example. And sleep difficulties with people with ASD are much more frequent. So the research varies on this, but anywhere between 50 and 80% of autistic individuals have sleep difficulties at some point. And it's not nearly that high at any age for people without autism. Okay, and we've talked about some of the difficulties that arise from having poor sleep. Research documents for autistic individuals, difficulties with attention, irritability, mood, self-injurious behaviors, and repetitive behaviors as well, where we see more of those. And sometimes the repetitive behaviors might be because that's an adaptive calming strategy for an autistic individual, but they might see more of those, in part because they have more things that are upsetting them during the day because they haven't slept well. So why are these difficulties for autistic people for sleep so much higher than others? So there's 3 main areas we think about around this. There's biological reasons, medical reasons, and behavioral reasons for this as well. And I'm going to focus on the behavioral piece today. When we think about the behavioral piece, right, we know there's some other difficulties autistic people may have that are more common that might relate to poor sleep. So one of those is a high level of anxiety for autistic people. And anxious people often have more trouble sleeping. There also may be difficulties with just overall arousal levels and having difficulty calming. I always like to kind of think about this as for so many autistic people, if you think about a glass of water, it's almost full or just till full because dealing with so many things all day long, so many challenging, hard things to deal with. And something can come up and then you're upset and your glass is overflowed. So I think this is a common difficulty and it can be hard then to calm down and regulate. And when there are nice studies showing that over-arousal and hyper-arousal does lead to more difficulties with sleep. And then we mentioned these social cues as a way of helping to entrain or keep our circadian rhythms in line. And sometimes that's harder for an autistic person or an autistic child to recognize. It's like, well, the lights are being turned off, people are turning off TVs and getting into pajamas, but I'm still feeling kind of awake. So I'm not getting this cue that I need to be doing the sleep thing as well. And then transition and change is often very difficult for an autistic person. And, the transition from wake to sleep is one of the more difficult transitions we all have to do every day. It's not an easy one. So we're talking about something that's kind of hard to do in general, and we need to apply it to something that's often very difficult. So we've got kind of this double whammy around the transition from wake to sleep. Okay. Just briefly around some of the biological differences, there are some research showing that circadian rhythms may be different for people on the spectrum. There may be a difference in melatonin production, either the amount, or it may be related to precursors to so other hormones and that help produce melatonin. And then also there might just be variations in when melatonin, endogenous melatonin, is secreted. So it might not be about the actual amount, but it might be when this happens that might be different. So thinking out now about behavioral strategies, right? So I'm going to cover a few areas that I think can really make a difference. I've seen it. We've done research that has supported this as well. Thinking about what happens during the day, this evening time. What does the sleep environment look like? How about when bedtime occurs? How much sleep should someone be getting? Bedtime routines and use of visual supports. So those are the main things we're going to cover. I think for all of those, it's always important to think about, specific individual considerations, which include any communication challenges someone has or communication strategies to keep in mind, this person's understanding of social cues, how we may use those, need for sameness, difficulties with that transition and flexibility around sleep or how you're sleeping, and absolutely always the sensory piece of all this. Okay, so when we're thinking about daytime, the factors that I like to consider and think about is how much exercise someone's getting during the day, light exposure, caffeine, naps, as we talked about a little bit, and bedtime use. So exercise is good for many, many reasons. It helps with functioning in all kinds of ways. Exercise absolutely helps with sleep. There's a lot of nice research showing that. For most people, exercise earlier in the day is better than in the evening or close to bedtime, because again, we want the arousal levels down during that evening time and transition to sleep. And for most people, exercising kind of gets you more aroused. But having exercise ideally around the same time each day is best. We want lots of light exposure during the day, first thing in the morning in particular, but throughout the day until we get to night. Because that's going to bring our melatonin levels down, and it's also going to just kind of help keep our circadian rhythms in sync. Caffeine absolutely interferes with sleep, and there's some sleep research which say you shouldn't have any caffeine. I don't drink caffeine at all. I'm very, very sensitive to it, so I don't use it. But I think if you say to someone like, you just shouldn't have any caffeine anymore, that would be kind of like a deal breaker right there. So you have to be sensitive about it, but really caffeine after probably about noon or so may not be such a great idea. The half-life of caffeine is probably about 6 hours or maybe a little longer. We don't know what it's like in children. So we just want to be careful about that intake. Work with many children who will drink Coke or Mountain Dew or tea with caffeine in it. Chocolate has caffeine. You just kind of learn to be kind of a caffeine detective in terms of what someone's drinking or eating, right? They put caffeine in so many things now, and when. And then maybe thinking through some gradual changes to that. Again, very common in our clinic. We'll talk about like, well, maybe you can still have that Mountain Dew, but maybe it needs to be earlier in the day. Maybe we can substitute it out for non-caffeinated, or we could start diluting the caffeinated beverage with non-caffeinated slowly till we get to a point where we're not having the caffeine, because it really is an important piece of good sleep, a good set of sleep habits. Naps can be tricky. So this is really going to kind of depend on your age, right? Young children still nap. Sometimes teens who are on a much later schedule because that is how they're geared. When you go through adolescence, you start going to bed later and wanting to wake up later, even though you can't always do it, just because of the shift in your circadian rhythms, which then resolves again once you get past adolescence. So naps can be tricky, but naps can interfere with that sleep drive. Remember that homeostatic sleep drive we were talking about. So you have to kind of think through it individually. A good rule of thumb is be up by 4 or so at the latest. And then just kind of think through what time is the nap, how long, collect some data, figure it out. I've worked with some families where we've just done this fine tuning and figured out a nap till 3:30 is okay, a nap till 3:45 is not. Just as one example, or sometimes it's in, it's especially for younger children, it's a balancing act, because no nap could make for a very difficult, grouchy afternoon. So you have to kind of think through how you're going to do naps and how that's going to work. But a short nap in the car at 4:30 can make it very, very hard to fall asleep at bedtime. And then you've got this whole other set of sleep problems that start cycling. So you just have to think about naps carefully. And bedroom use is a similar kind of thing. So ideally, your bed and bedroom, wherever you sleep, is just used for sleep and sleep related activities and nothing else. But that's not always possible. Certainly many families, bedroom has to be the place to play. There's no other place to play. We might think about, can it not be on the bed? So the bed is just for sleep, and maybe we can mark off a spot in the room, maybe even with painter's tape, that's for play. We could think about maybe changing the bedding, making it clear that we're making this transition once daytime is over and we're moving to going to sleep. But thinking through bedroom use, being aware of each family's needs and each individual's needs about how that's going to work, so that we can really keep sleep specific. The bed is specific to sleep, excuse me. I think you can often see, like, if you spend a lot of time just playing, if a child spends a lot of time playing with their toys throughout the day in bed, and then it's nighttime and they still have their toys, it could be pretty hard to know, like, what am I supposed to be doing right now? I play. I associate play with my bed, not sleep. So we want to think through that as well. When we're thinking about evening habits, so this is that time, kind of after dinner, and we're moving from that to, getting ready for bed, but we're not there yet. We want to start thinking about how to maybe start limiting stimulating activities. Think about when our cutoff for that is. The hour before bed, ideally, we would like the lights as low as possible. There's different ways we think about doing that. And of course, it's all going to be a balance around things and just routines that are less stimulating. So, sometimes they're just have to kind of think through this, right? So some families do a lovely job of helping their child prepare for the next day at school and talk about what was hard about, that day and what they're going to do the next day. But sometimes that, again, can be very arousing, very anxiety provoking. So we might think about doing that earlier in the day, or maybe a little earlier in the evening. Depending on what we could do around lights, we think about, putting lights on dimmers, having lower light, thinking about those tablets for sure, using night mode. For some individuals, we'll talk about wearing glasses that filter out blue light. So we've been talking a lot about light, but white light has the full spectrum of the rainbow in it. Blue light, so from red to blue, if you remember your Roy G. Biv. So blue light interferes the most with sleep, and red light interferes the least. So our tablets, our phones, all the things we love to use, and all of us do before bed, right? So again, you have to be reasonable about what you're going to tell someone about what they can and can't do. But they have a lot of blue light. They have more blue light than a regular white light. So we want to think about ways to filter out that light and maybe put some limits on when are we going to be done with devices? When can we stop that? But even just regular white light, we want to start thinking about getting that down and maybe substituting out lights with red lights. A very common activity that happens at bedtime is bath time for younger children, and it can be very relaxing. Although again, we're going to sort through, is there any part of it that's overstimulating, you get too excited, or hair washing is a hard part, or getting out of the bath is a hard part. So we'll think through that. But sometimes you have this great, evening activity of being in the bath right before bed, and it's in a bright bathroom with bright white lights. So maybe we'll put up little red Christmas lights instead, or use red night lights instead of this bright white light. So we just kind of want to think through that and tailor it individually to a family's needs. Okay, and then we're going to talk about, what does a sleep environment look like? And we mentioned bedroom use, but I want to mention really a person's going to sleep where they need to sleep, right? So this includes sleeping for young children or older children, sleeping in the same room or same bed with their parents, sleeping on a couch, sharing beds. In our clinic, I actually feel very strongly about this. There are so many reasons that families have for sleeping the way they do. There might be concerned medically, there may be cultural reasons, there might be financial reasons. It may just be how their family likes to be. You don't have to have a good reason for that. But however they're sleeping, we're going to talk more about this. We want it to stay consistent throughout the night. And then we want to think about some aspects of the sleep environment that might help promote sleep. So when I mention it being consistent, and we'll talk again a little more about this later, but if we think about families who like to co-sleep, again, that is absolutely fine. No judgment at any age. That is fine. But co-sleeping means you spend all night in the same place. It's not about cuddling till your child falls asleep and then you leave. And again, why is that? Not a judgy thing, but because it's going to result in more night wakings if you do that. So we'll talk about that. But back to just sort of what does the sleep environment look like? We're going to think about temperature. People tend to sleep better in a cooler room. Too cold, of course, you have to be comfortable, but cooler temperatures are better. And we want, of course, comfortable, bedding. I have this little picture of a sleeping bag here because for a lot of families, we'll think about some kind of cotton or fleece sleeping bag. Weighted blankets can be very helpful, but something that provides some input when we do. Sometimes we'll talk about sleeping bags first because families will have one and we could just see if that works for their child. The only kind of sleeping bag I found that is not helpful is a nylon one because it's just very, very slippy. But we want to make sure bedding is comfortable, and sometimes things like a weighted blanket or a sleeping bag can help with restlessness, restless leg syndrome, as I mentioned. So it helps with that, and then can help increase quality of sleep. We'll kind of think through some of those aspects. Some children sleep and adults too sleep very hot. So they make cooling pads and cooling pillows that could help as well. The research, I will say, on weighted blankets is mixed, but anecdotally, I've certainly seen many families who have found it to be incredibly helpful for their child. And sometimes we'll put the weighted blanket over the sleeping bag because then you're restless enough that you manage to kick off the weighted blanket or throw it off. And if you're in a sleeping bag, that helps a little bit. Sound can make a big difference. So sometimes we will use sound machines, apps that have a consistent sound, again, all night. We want that. And of course, we want minimal light. You can have a night light, but we want a red night light if you're going to use one. And we want to think through, are there any other lights on, like maybe a humidifier and it's got a little blue light on it. And again, blue light interferes the most with sleep. So we just think through what lights are in the room and how can we minimize that while still, making it a cozy, nice place to sleep. Okay, so that's a sample of a red night light. People have figured this out, so you can get like a 4-pack for not too much money. And I also like this Christmas light idea because lots of people have those in the house and you could use those. So let's talk about bedtime routines. When we're thinking about, so now we've kind of figured out, we've done stuff during the day, we've got our evening moving towards sleep, just coming up with, from my very sleep-centric point of view, the whole day is around exercise, eat at the right times, and then eat, don't nap till late, think about what you eat, and have a more calm evening. And then we get to a bedtime routine. And that really, I think, is helpful for there to be a consistent set of activities that the individual does every night in the same order. They're all easy, they're all calming, and they're going to help a person's body and their mind learn, like, oh, I do these things, and then I go into bed and fall asleep. And it really does help. I think visual schedules can make a huge difference around that. We want to come up with like a nice set of routines that everyone kind of realizes this is what we do. Electronic sleep aids, again, the issue around that is if you use it at the beginning of the night, you're going to need it to stay consistent all night. So if you listen to music to fall asleep, that's okay. But then we want that music on all night. So sometimes it's better to turn it off before or figure out a way to keep it on. so that it's on all night. So we want to think about that. Probably don't want your iPad on all night, right? So it might be about using your iPad and then turning it off so that you're falling asleep without it. I think visuals can make a huge difference. I was part of a research study a while back where part of the project was to give people a visual schedule. And so I worked with a lot of their bedtime routine. So I worked with a lot of families that said, I don't think I need that. And I'm like, please just take it. You're supposed to for the study. So can you do this? And a lot of families came back and said, you know what? I didn't think it was going to work, but it was really helpful. So I think I like using them. I think they're helpful. I have certainly worked with families who have talked about that just being something that, you know, is a trigger for their child. I think this, as much as I like them, I have to respect that for some, it's not for everyone. And of course we want a calm bedtime routine. So we're not going to always use them, but generally speaking, I think they're great. Here's a couple samples of this. One of the things that we will also often talk about is we're coming up with a good bedtime routine. It's going to be some trial and error, and really to think through, is it really calming? Is it really easy and relaxing? So I mentioned bath time. That's a huge one where there's various, you know, trouble points that we want to think through and make sure that we've thought about those and addressed those. Sometimes it's about figuring out a good transition out of the bath, or some gentle ways to do hair washing, or maybe only doing hair washing once in a while. And that could be, bath time could be at a different time of day. So we'll move things around. Teeth brushing, of course, is another huge challenge for many autistic children. And so we'll think about, can we just brush teeth like right after dinner and then have lots of time to recover while we're still working on ways to make, you know, teeth brushing go better, to make bath time go better, and to just, I feel like it's a great example of this. And when I talk with families, like, I know things about sleep, but the families I work with, they're really the sleep experts for their child, and they're the expert on their child. So for all the things we're talking about, it's always a collaboration, always a way of talking about, does this, you know, what do you think? Here's, you know what I know now about this. What do you think? Let's work together to figure out how we can make this happen. Or, you know, maybe we just have to both know that this is part of what's going to make sleep harder, but there's nothing else we could do about it right now. Or we can think about this little baby step we can make around it. But it's a very, very important part of the process for me, is to be very respectful of parents, their knowledge, what they think will work or not work. And to also very much acknowledge that I'm not doing it right. We're going to give ideas, but parents have to do this hard work and figure this out. So, and for, you know, when we work with individuals who are kind of in charge of their own sleep, it's hard. And so just want to be, you know, supportive consultants to the process. Okay. So visuals, you know, I think are great. Again, I mentioned for some people they could be triggers, but for some people using icons or photos just aren't that meaningful. So maybe we'll actually use an object schedule. So this is just an example of that. So each object represents what we're going to do during the bedtime routine. And if objects aren't that meaningful, or it's not that easy to do, maybe we'll do some cues in the environment. I mentioned change the bedding. Make sure you've got, you know, maybe have a scented lotion, and that lotion's just for bedtime, even though you might use lotion other times through your day. So you've got some cue. This is what we do. This represents this transition we're making from wakefulness to sleep. So we'll kind of think through that piece as well, figure out what might work. You know, I work with some children who they come home from school, they've had a hard day. They want to get into their PJs like at 3 in the afternoon. And it's like, so this is another good example. I'm not going to say, well, I don't want you to be in your pajamas from 3. And this works for this person and this family. But maybe we could put on a new pair of pajamas at bedtime, or put on, you know, if you're in just a t-shirt and you like to sleep in your t-shirt, a new t-shirt for bedtime. So we're marking it so we know awake, sleep. Okay. I mentioned sensory strategies. They're huge. As you all know, they're highly individual. What's calming for one person could be activating for someone else. So we just need to think through for that individual, what's calming, what isn't, what might be helpful. You know, we talked about thinking about sleeping bags and maybe bed tents. Think about a sound machine or white noise? What are the strategies that are helpful? And to really think through it. And if it's something I think very common is that sometimes it's relaxing and sometimes it's stimulating, it kind of depends, then we probably don't want that for a bedtime strategy if we can help it. We will want something that is, pretty consistent, pretty reliable, is something that is calming and easy. So we'll think through those things together. Okay. And then we want to think about the timing. We'll get back to this idea of circadian rhythms and think through when is bedtime? When should it be? So first off, there's lots of data about what seems to be sort of a typical amount of time for sleep, and a recommended time for sleep for someone without autism of all ages. And there's charts for that. There's, recommended, there's, it might be okay. There's a wide range because everyone has their own kind of individual sleep needs around that. And we're talking about, within 24 hours, how many hours a night should you sleep? So it's sometimes helpful to keep that in mind. But again, there's such wide variation. And we don't have that kind of detailed information for individuals with autism. So we don't know, maybe autistic people kind of need less sleep. Maybe they don't, maybe it's exactly the same. But I think that it's sometimes helpful to know that when we're working with someone who's maybe getting less sleep than what the charts and the books say. The real key to that is how is a person functioning during the day? That's how you really know. This can be tricky sometimes because someone with autism might be having really hard days, and it might not be because of their sleep. It might be because of a lot of other things they're having to deal with. So it can be tricky to figure that out, but we try to kind of keep that in mind. And then we want to think about when bedtime is, when you're actually getting into bed and either expecting yourself or expecting your child to fall asleep. You remember when we were talking about the circadian rhythms that there's this forbidden zone. There's this time when you kind of can't fall asleep because you're having this bump in arousal, right? So going to bed at that time is not such a great idea. It's probably going to make you more anxious. You're going to toss and turn. I would imagine that many people on this call have tried it. You're getting up really early for an appointment or to catch a plane, and you go to bed extra early. You think this will be great. I'm just going to go to bed early, and then I can wake up early, and I'll still get all the sleep in. And you just lie in bed, and you don't fall asleep. It's very, very common, and often it then backfires, right? Because then it's like, you've been lying in bed, you've gotten more anxious, so now it's harder to fall asleep even at your regular time to fall asleep. And you just kind of watch the clock, and it gets later and later, and you get more and more worried. So we don't want to repeat that for someone on a daily basis, where we're just putting them in the bed at a time that's not the right time for them. So we will often kind of talk with parents about that and figure out when's a good time to start. This chart sort of shows, again, this idea of the forbidden zone. And this idea of, and researchers call it this, right? Of like when, so we want to avoid that for bedtime. And I will say that for many families that we work with, we'll actually talk about when is your child actually falling asleep? And sometimes it's late. And, parents feel like, oh, I'm doing something bad. My child's falling asleep at 10:30, 11:30, midnight. So again, always very important, no judgment. It's not about that. And work with so many families where the person who's having difficulty sleeping is the person with autism for all the reasons we just talked about. It's not about parenting. It's not that they don't know how to help children fall asleep, but there's a lot of other factors. But regardless, if someone's always falling asleep around 11:30 or 12, what we might do is say, you know what? You talked about putting some of these strategies in place. I'm going to talk about more of them now. Let's do these around midnight. Let's just go with it. Lead into it. This is when your child's falling asleep. It won't be forever, but we'll develop some new habits. We'll have a good bedtime routine. We'll learn to get the lights down low. We'll learn to put, activities that are hard to let go of, whether they're an iPad or something else, away just a few minutes before bed. And hopefully then, instead of it taking hours for you to fall asleep, it's just taking a reasonable amount of time. And usually for sleep research, we look for maybe 20 to 30 minutes. It shouldn't take much longer than that. So then we've got that works at midnight. Then we could start doing all these lovely things we put in place at 11:45 instead of midnight. And yeah, that's still working. Then we can back it down again by 15 minutes. And we just keep going slowly back and back. You can only go so far because you're going to hit that forbidden zone. But at some point, you're done and you've learned good habits. It works very, very well for many children. Every once in a while, we work with someone who just needs a lot of time to unwind in bed. And so we have them go to bed later and then they're just up even later. So it doesn't always work. There's always some trial and error, but mostly it's a good system. So this gets back to this idea of, you're having trouble falling asleep. Why? So it might just be that you're not sleepy. It's just not, and you might not be sleepy because you've been exposed to lots of light. You're got all this blue light coming in. It's not, you're in the forbidden zone, or maybe you're really anxious and you don't want to be your own bed or away from your parents because that's a scary, hard thing for you. So we want to try to sort through that. Either way, we're going to have some similar strategies eventually. For a child who's really anxious, one thing it's always helpful to kind of think about is, are they anxious about other things? So we get a sense of their overall levels of anxiety. And then what about anxiety around separation? Can they be separated from their parents? And then even kind of breaking that down a little bit more, because some children do fine going off to school, it's routine, they can do that. But if they're they're both at home with their parent and child are at home together, they want to be in the same room all the time because they're anxious about that. So we might work on some daytime separation before we even worry about nighttime separation. So we'll think through when it makes sense to do this. I think a lot of times that's one of the harder things to do. So let's get a good bedtime routine in place. Let's get some of these other sleep habits the way we think might help promote sleep. And then we can worry about this part about sleeping on your own, if that's what a family wants. Again, this is up to a family to decide if they want to do this. Once we start thinking about that, if a family said, many families do, no, I would like my child to sleep in their own room, thank you. Then we're going to think about what method we can use to help them do this. And one is a tried and true method called unmodified extinction, or crying it out. I don't ever recommend this strategy, but the research supports it. And by the way, there's research on sleep that's showing that like 80% of studies that are published show that behavioral strategies make a difference in helping with sleep. And a lot of those studies use this cry it out method. I don't think it's helpful really for any child, but especially for an autistic child with anxiety and difficulties with change and flexibility. And autistic children are incredibly determined, and if they don't want to do this, they're going to come up with a way not to. And behaviorally, if you start doing something like, I'm saying goodnight to you, I'm leaving, I am not coming back, and then you change your mind because your child's crying and upset and it breaks your heart and you don't want to do that. And I get that. Then what you've taught your child is, okay, so I have to cry, and I have to cry for a while, but then I get my mom or dad back. It's worth it. I'm going to do it. So you have to come up with a plan that you can be consistent with, or it's going to kind of backfire. So that is one method. Another method is to do what's called the checking in method. If you guys have heard of Ferber, that's actually, you say, oh, this child was Ferberized. It's the checking in method. It's not actually the cry it out method. And that's where you leave and you say, I'll be back in a minute. And you are back in a minute, and you check in, and then you leave again. And then the next time you make it a little longer, so it's not just a minute. So you're gradually increasing the amount of time you are giving your child to be alone before you go back in the room. It can work. I think for a lot of children that I work with, it's confusing and kind of frustrating for them. And I worked with many parents who try it. And again, for some, it works well, but for others, it can be challenging for those reasons. And then the last method that actually is my preference is called fading parental presence, or some people call it the rocking chair method. And what happens there when you're ready for this part of things is that you're still in your child's room while they're falling asleep, but you're in a chair with your back to the child. So they're not looking at you, you're not talking to them, but you're there. And you're probably fairly close to their bed, but hopefully far enough away with no touching. And there could be a lot of prep steps before you get to that. But then over time, gradually, you're going to move your chair farther and farther away from bed toward the bedroom door until eventually you're in the hallway. For many children, you kind of need this last step of a hand or a foot that's still in the bedroom, even though the rest of you is out in the hall, and then you're done. Once you can get to that step, you're basically done. I've worked with one family in all the years I've been doing this where the child somehow knew where the parent was in the hallway. We could never figure it out. So we just had to extend it all the way from hallway to their bedroom, but eventually we got there. Okay. So this all leads to, in some ways, night wakings and understanding those. And Mike Duran talks a lot about this idea of beginning at bedtime. It's a lovely way to think about it, which is how you fall asleep at the beginning of the night sort of sets the stage for how you're going to sleep throughout the night. This gets back to what we talked about at the beginning about these sleep cycles. When you cycle through these different phases of sleep, you are more likely to wake up, especially when you transition from a light phase to dreams, to heavier sleep. So we want things to be consistent. So I've mentioned this a few times, right? If you fall asleep to music, you want that music on all night. If you fall asleep to TV, you want to think about having that be on all night, because if it changes from when you first fell asleep, you are more likely to wake up during one of these 90-minute cycles. If you fall asleep on the couch and then you're moved to your bed, you are more likely to wake up. If you fall asleep cuddling with your parent and then your parent leaves because they want the rest of the night for themselves, you are more likely to wake up. So again, nothing wrong with cuddling, nothing wrong with listening to music, but we need it to be consistent. So oftentimes what's really helpful is to have these other activities that are calming and nice and cozy, like cuddling. Have those happen as part of the bedtime routine, but stop them before your child falls asleep, so they've got some time to fall asleep on their own and settle. And again, gradual steps around that can often be very helpful to start doing that when the child's very drowsy, but they're not yet asleep. So they've got maybe just like 30 seconds to just kind of settle, not very much. But over time, you're going to make that longer. So you'll stop cuddling a little bit earlier in that process. And then it sometimes helps to think through, like, what else could the child cuddle with? What can we substitute? So we'll use body pillows, big stuffed animals. I work with a great mom she was fine. She wanted to share a bed. She was okay with that, but her child wanted her arm over his chest while she fell asleep. And she didn't want that all night. And if she took her arm away, he'd wake up, because that was another change, right, from when he first fell asleep. So we did some work together. We found a nice weighted pillow, put that on him while he was falling asleep with her arm, right? Because again, kids are going to be like, I don't want the pillow, I want your arm. But if I can have the pillow and your arm, that might be okay. So spent some time getting him used to the pillow with her arm. And then gradually, when he was drowsy, she kept the pillow on and she moved her arm away. And eventually she got her arm back, which made her very happy. Okay. So with night wakings, what do you do with a night waking? So of course you want to think about why. Also very important, all those medical considerations often can affect night waking. If you're in pain, you're more likely to wake up during one of these 90-minute transitions. If you have obstructive sleep apnea, if you are restless. So we want to, very important to think about what else might be causing a night waking. If we know that it's behavioral, then we want to think through, well, how did this person fall asleep at the beginning of the night? Is it fair to say, well, just fall back asleep? If he cuddled all up next to you and now you're gone, it's like he's lost his pillow, he's lost the thing that basically helps him fall asleep. We have to think about this. Ideally, we've taken care of this at the beginning of the night, so you don't have to worry about during night wakings, or know that until that changes, you probably do need to provide what your child needs in order to fall back asleep. So we think through those pieces. Generally speaking, it's best to respond quickly to distress. If the child gets too aroused, it's going to be very hard for them to fall back asleep. So we want to think through that. There's a lot of kind of trial error and judgment around what is quickly enough. Regardless, we want to try to keep those night wakings brief and boring, so they're not reinforcing. Sometimes some visual aids and social stories can help a lot with that. And making a change around that when a child's used to things a certain way, want to kind of be prepared for the idea that it might get worse before it gets better, because there might be a little bit of testing involved with the new change. Like, really? You're really doing it this way now? But again, we want to go back to, we want to make sure that this person knows how to fall asleep. So we're being reasonable about this. And sometimes putting some rewards in around the new nighttime habits can be helpful. Want to think through what else happens at night. So for many children, it might be a snack or having a drink of milk or something like that. That can help increase night wakings, actually, because then you've got your body's processing food if you're exposed to light during the night. So we want to think through some of those kinds of factors as well. Another really nice strategy that can work with night wakings and that ability to kind of fall asleep on your own at the beginning of the night is a bedtime pass. So that's just a little card, and these are kind of boring pictures of what's on the pass, but you can have some kind of picture on it. It can be very fun to come up with photos or pictures of things that's like a child's special interest. I've done like Bigfoot bedtime passes and things like that, but it's a little card, and a child gets this at the beginning of the night. When you say goodnight to them, they've got their bedtime pass, and if they need to check in, they're anxious, and they need to know that they can check in with their parents, they've got their pass. It's a promise. Parent will come if they call, but when the parent comes, the child gives that pass to the parent. So now they don't have it anymore. And some children need more than one to start, right? If the child doesn't use their pass, then in the morning, they can give that same pass to their parent and trade it in for some kind of prize or reward. And it doesn't have to be a big prize. It can be something that's meaningful to that child. I wanted to mention early morning awakenings. These can be kind of different than middle of the night wakings. These are where you wake up early and you're just up for the day. So we always want to think about depression or mood. For some children, it's just about, they're going to sleep 8.5, 9 hours. That's it. So as a parent, you just kind of decide, do I want to delay bedtime so that you can wake up later? Or, when do I want my 8.5 and 9 hours of sleep? We teach children to learn to stay in bed or play quietly. Again, we can provide for rewards for that. Always want to think about safety with night wakings as well as early morning awakenings. So we want to think about things like child-proofing doors and cabinets, maybe using monitors. Sometimes it's a simple alarm or bell, so you know what is going on. We certainly work with some families where a medical safety bed makes a lot of sense. When I first started, I always thought, like, I don't think we don't need to do that. That's not something we need, but they can be very helpful for some families, and they make some new ones now that are great. And for families who are Medicaid waivers, that will sometimes cover some of those, and that's the nice ones with lots of nice sensory features as well. And I have worked with some families where just being in the bed and having that kind of support and feeling safe in the bed has helped children sleep better. So I just wanted to mention that a lot of what we talked about, you can find online on the Autism Speaks ATN toolkits. There's strategies for sleep and quick tips. Information about using visuals is there as well, visual supports. And I have a book on sleep as well that talks about many of these things. I worked on these toolkits as well as the book. So a lot of what we talked about today, you would find in that written material as well. So those were the main points I wanted to cover. And I would now be glad to answer any questions that folks may have.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
Well, I had lots of questions come up.
All right, great.
One is about melatonin. I have heard from a pediatrician more recently that there was sort of a push towards more melatonin, and now they're pulling that back to less in children. Have you heard about that?
Well, what you just said, the short answer to what you just said is no, but I tell you about other things around melatonin. So also I will mention that Autism Speaks has a nice guide to melatonin as well that talks about things. So, and everything kind of research kind of catches up. There's a very nice study that looks at melatonin use in autistic children, and they looked at giving 3 milligrams, 6 milligrams, and 9 milligrams. And by the way, brand matters, and you need to think about that, because there have been studies, so research studies looking at what's in melatonin. You know, melatonin is not controlled or overseen by government in any way. Wow, thanks, Brian. You're great. So, and you know, any kind of over-the-counter, you know, supplements, those aren't controlled. So people can put whatever they want in them. And it's probably true for lots of supplements, and maybe there've been studies on those, I don't know, but I know about the melatonin ones, and people do put whatever they want in them. So they're just not controlled. They put Benadryl in them. They could put more melatonin than they say they've put in them. It varies even within a lot of, like, so a particular company makes it and it's lot number, you know, 1789. Within that same lot, there could be different amounts of stuff in the melatonin. So you want, you know, you can look at the industry regulates itself a little. So you can look at one of I always forget the names of them, but there's, and I can get this for people if they want, but you can look at, you know, is the company you're interested in one of these companies, but also the brand Natrol, Natrol, and Life Extension Foundation. Both of those have been found to be high grade melatonin and consistent and reliable. So I think that's an important piece when you think about this. Now, getting back to that study. So they looked at 3 milligrams, 6, and 9. And what they found was that many children did respond to 3 milligrams. It helped with their sleep. It helped them fall asleep more quickly. And for children where 3 wasn't enough, 6, you know, upping it to 6 was helpful and worked. And for a very small percent of children, 9 worked, but mostly like somewhere between 3 and 6 would be what you'd expect. So, and the other thing is that melatonin is known to help you fall asleep, but not stay asleep. So that's an important piece as well. So I think it can be very effective. Now, are there side effects to melatonin? Some individuals do have, there's a paradoxical effect for some, even on good melatonin, right? If you're not using a good brand and it hasn't worked, I would say, and you're up to trying it again, I would say, try one of these better brands, see if it works. But even with that, it may be that, you know, you have a paradoxical effect. It can cause irritability, sometimes nightmares. People worry, it's a hormone, so people worry about long-term use and what that might do. But so far, there haven't been any studies establishing that it's a problem. And there are apps, and then people worry also about, like, could there be dependence? But again, the research hasn't supported that. So I think those are some factors. Again, it's not, we don't expect it to help with night waking. There's some, it's not really readily available, and extended release would be pills, which is limiting for many, many children. But there's some thought that maybe extended release melatonin might be better for those night wakings. You're taking melatonin as a sleep aid, right? Generally recommended you take these, like, and you can even start smaller than 3. In our clinic, we'll sometimes start even at 1 milligram or even a little less. If it's a really little person, or we're just like, we're not sure. I once worked with a family where a parent talked about having a really negative reaction, and it was biological parent. And so we were like, yeah, maybe you don't want to do it at all, but if you do, let's try just a little bit and let's see what happens. There's also some evidence that taking an extremely small dose around 6 hours before bedtime might kind of reset circadian rhythms and kind of jumpstart things a little bit and help. So that's another, not incredibly well researched, but it's there as something that could be helpful to do too. So, I think, so we still recommend it. I don't know of it being something people are doing less of, although maybe people are thinking more about this, biologic dose that I was just describing. So that might fit with what you were talking about, or just the idea that it's not always going to be helpful to folks for those night wakings, So I don't know. There's a very long answer to your question. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, and more. It's wonderful. I also was wondering, this is personal I have a 17-year-old on the spectrum who's been on melatonin for years. We're for the first time really now we're letting him go to sleep later. Because we think he's old enough, for that. And is it possible that like his beginnings of his sleep cycle really are like 1 a.m. like that's normal?
Well, okay, so, when we get to specific time, hard to know, but he's 17. So one thing that happens, I mentioned this earlier in the talk, that teens do move to a later time. So their circadian rhythm shift. It's just another way that teenagers are different from many other people. So it's natural to see this later time. You guys may be aware there's been a lot pushed to have high school start later, because it is known that adolescents they just can't fall asleep that early. And then you're asking them to get up really early to go to high school. And for some, you're asking them to drive. And it's like, basically that's scary, right? Like you shouldn't be doing it. And then their learning gets affected too. But so he's 17. So he really may be going to bed, falling asleep later. And one is late. And I'd be looking at what else is happening. All these things we were talking about today, right? Like exposure to light, what's he doing? How relaxed is he? What kind of bedtime routine does he have? All those things to see what's up. It is certainly possible, though, that if you kind of left him to his own devices and you didn't have to, it's summer, right? You didn't have to worry about school or getting up. And he was like, that's when he falls asleep. He falls asleep at 1 and then he sleeps till, 11 or 12 or that might just be where he's at. There is also delayed sleep phase disorder, where it goes beyond just being a teenager, where you're really, it's very late. Even that diagnosis, right, though, is still defined somewhat by your community and where you are, right? Because if everybody in your family went to bed at 1, if you like that, I've worked with some families who are in the restaurant business, they all get home really late. It's okay for their child to sleep late. Everybody's happy, then it's okay. But if you have to get to school, if you have to get to work, then you have to figure this out and figure out a way to deal with it. So that might be a piece with that 1 o'clock. You want to think through those things. You'd want to think through, is there, again, anything medical that's keeping them up? But it may be that that's just kind of left to his own when he would do this. And then you're like, but still, all these other strategies, since you can't go to bed at 1 and wake up at 11, you're nodding, so I'm assuming that's true for your family, so we can't just say it's okay. Then we need to think through things like, being really careful about light, being when you first wake up, when you go to bed. All these other factors are going to be really important. And it's also going to be important to maintain a consistent bedtime throughout the week and weekend, because if it really is sort of his natural time, then that's what he's going to fall back on. And it's going to be easy for that to happen for him. So so generally we want to keep weekday and weekend wake times and bedtimes around the same. It's very hard for everyone to do. And when I wrote the book that we were talking about, my editor, I said within an hour, and she came back to me and she said, you can't say that. I have a teenager. I'm not going to let you say that. You could have 2 hours and that is it. So I was like, okay. And she had a child with special needs. So I trusted her on that, but you wouldn't want to go much more than that, because otherwise what you're doing is setting up a situation where you've got jet lag. They call it social jet lag. And that can happen a lot for teens just generally. So you want to keep things in a pretty consistent pace. And then the other piece is, so you do whatever you can to make things conducive for sleep at night, but you can't make a person fall asleep, but you can affect their wake time. So not easy to do, and especially in the summer, but once, as you're anticipating school starting, you could be starting to think about like, well, we can't sleep till 11 anymore. So we're going to start waking you up. Again, this gradual little steps, we're going to start at 10:45. That's probably, you won't love it, but you'll be up. Maybe you'll be able to go to bed a little bit earlier. We'll do all the other things we need to do, lots of light exposure when you wake up, low light at night, calming routines. And we'll do that for a few days. Then we'll do 10:30 in the morning, because you can control wake time, to a much better extent. And sometimes just getting back to school helps with that too.
Thank you so much.
It's a great question. Lets me talk about a lot of stuff that's important. So thank you. Brian, it looks like you have a question.
Just a comment. I want to appreciate your, what I'll call a gentle approach. I am on the autism spectrum, and sleep has been a lifelong issue that's been all over the place. And at one time it was my parents trying to figure it out, and now it's me trying to figure it out. And sometimes I'm on my own, other times I have an occupational therapist or a psychologist or someone, on the team, so to speak, to help me. And even with sometimes the best minds and the best intentions, it's still just unwieldy. And so gentleness is, I'm getting so much more mileage out of that. And a supportive approach. Well, if that option is a no-go, what else have we got? And there's always so many other options. So I just wanted to appreciate that mindset that you brought to us today.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah, it's very important to me. I'm glad that you find that to be a helpful way to go. And I loved what you said. It's true. There's always something else you could try. There's always something. And you could circle back too, right? So it could be like, well, this didn't work, but maybe now we've done these other things, so maybe we could go back to this other thing and try it. And yeah, never any judgment about it, because it's hard. It's really hard, but it really can get better. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
I have another question. It's about resources for help with sleep. Obviously, your department would be a fantastic resource. I have heard National Jewish does a lot with sleep. Do you know if they would be like a good place for folks to reach out to if they can't get in with your clinic?
They do a lot with sleep, so I think that probably is an option. I don't know a lot about what they're doing now around that, but they absolutely do, and there's some very good people there who are do great work. So I think that's a good option. I've worked with families who've worked at Rocky Mountain Pediatric Hospital. They have some sleep people. I haven't worked with anyone there personally, so I can't say specifically, but I think they do some work. Sometimes some of the, I guess I could still call them CCBs. The CCBs provide sleep.
Okay.
Especially in earlier intervention, but I think even beyond earlier intervention, they'll sometimes do. So you can ask about that as well.
Okay.
And Kirsten, I did do a sleep study when she showed the kid with all the things hooked up, and it was the sleep clinic at National Jewish that I got referred to, who then ordered the sleep study. So I've been through the process at National Jewish.
Okay.
And they work with children too. That's great. I hope that was a positive experience for you, Brian.
I mean, like you said, it was something to try, and then I learned that there were not physical obstructions, physical things going on, and so that was part of the rule out process, and maybe that gave me some peace of mind that contributed to better sleep.
That's a good point. It can, I mean, definitely preparing for it is important, especially for children. And there's more and more work being done on home sleep studies, I should say, but it's not clear how accurate those are for even adults who have like mild obstructive sleep apnea. So I think the research that's been done has been like moderate to severe sleep apnea, but that might be an option for children as well. We're starting to get a little more research on children with that. And I like what you said about it. It's very important to just know, and for parents to know too. We also have, and Children's provides this too, a nice social story that goes through the steps of a sleep study. So that can be helpful. And Children's also has a video. I would, if you're thinking about showing that to your child, I would look at it first yourself. So you know that this would be, when would be a good time to show them, how it'd be helpful. My experience is for a lot of families, it's really helpful for parents to know all the steps so they can know, oh yeah, now this is what we have to work on versus something else. I've certainly worked with some teens where I worked with one in particular who didn't like the idea that people were going to watch him sleep. So that was but better to find out before the sleep study. He was like, yeah, I'm not doing this. Nobody's watching me sleep. But we figured it out. But it was much better to figure that out before it was time to go in for the study, right? So watching the videos, looking at the social story, thinking through what might be done. They do tours also. I think they're back to doing that. I mean, they obviously stopped during the pandemic, but I think they're back to doing tours if you need them as well. Yes.
Well, I see it's already 3:20. This went really fast. But it's just amazing to have all that information in one place. And we will certainly pass your information along to anyone who's asking for support in this area.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'd be glad to, anytime people have questions, let me know. I'd be glad to try to help.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. It was a great to meet you.
Great group. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for the opportunity to do it. And thanks for all that you guys do. You do a wonderful. Really appreciate your place in the community and the support you provide. So thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to end. Bye-bye.